Hello and welcome to our new video. In today's video, we will talk about the gross domestic product, or GDP. By discussing the method by which it is calculated in India, we will try to discuss the various approaches, and explain some key concepts involved in the calculation of the GDP of nations. Because this is quite an elaborate topic, and involves understanding some statistical and economic principles to understand it, we will adopt the approach which a good commander does, by standing on a high vantage point, to take stock of the battlefield, and get an overview, before attempting to tackle things at the ground level. We will begin by defining GDP at a superficial and high level, and then, get down to dissecting its components, to understand it more deeply. The combined value of all the products and services consumed internally, or exported for consumption abroad, by an economy, over a period of time, for which an economic value can be assigned, is called its gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is calculated for a country, a state, or some other economic region, the borders of which we can clearly define and control. GDP is always measured, not for a point in time, like a balance sheet, but for a period of time, such as a year, a quarter, etc. Thus, it is not a measure of wealth, but of the productivity of an economy. Something is included in the calculation of GDP, when either it is exported, and exits the borders of the economy, or is bought for consumption by an end consumer. To avoid multiple count of the same material, intermediate and semi-finished products are not considered for GDP. For example, if a car battery is used in the production of a car, it will be included in GDP calculation, when the car is purchased by an end consumer. But, a battery sold separately in a shop, which is bought by an end consumer, is no longer a production consumable, but is now a finished product, which is included in the GDP calculation on sale. GDP calculations include, not only goods, such as agricultural and forest produce and livestock, production in mines and factories, which is sold in showrooms and stores, but also utilities, such as electricity, water, health services, communication, and software, and services of government employees, and the military, and professional services like lawyers, accountants and doctors etc. In computing GDP, only those things are taken into account, which have a market value, and thus, can be bought and sold. This is why, social and charitable work done informally by individuals, and value of the huge contribution to society which women make, by putting their skills and labor to use, in the running of households, is not included in the calculation of GDP, despite its substantial economic value. With this definition, and a high-level understanding of GDP, we come to the various approaches used in its calculation. The first one that we will talk about, is called the factors of production approach. In this, we calculate the GDP by adding up the value of the various factors, namely, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, that are put to use, in the creating and the delivering of goods or services, for use by customers. Some people explain factor cost, by equating it to factory cost, which is not right, as it creates a very restrictive interpretation of the term factor, in the minds of people. The first factor is, the rent of the farm, mine, factory, office, or shop, for the period for which GDP is being calculated. For this purpose, the real, or nominal rent, and not the purchase cost of property is to be taken, as the cost, only for the period of GDP calculation needs to be taken. The next factor is comprised of, the salary and wages of farm workers, and other people engaged in the production of goods and services. Then comes, the cost of raw material, energy, equipment and the interest on the money employed, and the cost of services and facilities, used to bring the material to the customers. The final factor is, the profit of the farmer, industrialist, or the shopkeeper, who undertakes the risks involved in producing that commodity or service. When we calculate the GDP by combining all these, the approach is called the factors of production method. The next method of calculating GDP is the value-added approach. Under this method, the increase in the price of a product or service, as it passes through different stages, till it becomes fit to be consumed, is considered as value addition. For example, if a process or factory takes some material from outside, which cost 100, and then employing some factors of production on it, and including their margin, raises its price to 150, then they have done a value addition of 50. Using this approach, if such an item was imported into an economy, and going through different stages, by the time it is consumed, or exported out of the economy, its price becomes 280, then it means, value addition of 180, was done by the economy. This method is very relevant for economies, such as Japan, or Singapore, that have few natural resources of their own, but instead, create value and national income, by importing raw, or semi-finished material, and processing and refining them. Knowing the value addition, at different stages of production, for a product which is produced by a multi-level process, comes in handy, in the cases of countries like India, where the data for the cost of output is not readily available, for smaller business units that only produce components. If we take a closer look at these two methods, that is, the factor of production approach, and the value addition approach, both are fundamentally the same, because both of these methods accumulate the amount related to factors or resources used in production. This is why we consider these two as one and put them under production-based approach. Which of these methods is used, will depend on the nature of that item, and sources of data, available in an economy or a sector, for GDP calculation. Moving on from production and resources, there is another approach to compute GDP, in which we calculate GDP, based on the productivity of the institutions, and people in an economy. In this method, we start with the wages of all the workers working in the different sectors of the economy, the salaries of professionals, government employees, and military personnel, and wages of farm and rural laborers. To these, we add the profits of the corporations, both government and private, and other establishments and businesses. In this way, we calculate GDP, by adding the income and salaries of all individuals and artificial persons in an economy, which is why this method is known as the income approach. This approach works particularly well for services. In India, we use a mixed, or hybrid method, where we calculate the GDP for output of farm, forest products, meat and fish, mining, and those of factories or establishments registered under the Factories Act, and for the construction sector, by using the production approach. While for utilities like supply of electricity, gas, and water, trading, hotels and restaurants, transportation, storage, communication, banking and insurance, real estate, residential rental, business services, public administration, defense, and all other services, we use the income approach. Apart from these, there is another approach, which is used in calculating of GDP, which is based on the money spent in an economy. In this method, every type of expenditure made by the private individuals, both in movable as well as real estate assets, and the amount spent on daily needs and luxuries, is the starting point. However, investments made in financial assets are not added, as they are considered savings. Similarly, expenditure on purchase of second-hand goods is not counted, as they do not reflect something new created by the economy. To this amount, we add all the capital investment made by industries, traders, and other businesses. We further add the amount of government expenditure on procurements, and construction and development of the infrastructure. All this put together, gives us the total amount of consumption within the economy. But since the entire production in an economy is not necessarily consumed inside the economy, the amount of total exports, for the period under consideration, is added, and the amount of total imports is reduced. This is how the gross domestic product is calculated, under the expenditure approach. This method is mostly used in the developed countries. In India, we cannot use it because, as we will see later in the video, the sources of data used for calculating the GDP, are extremely restricted, and need a lot of development and maturity, before we can get all the data for expenditure approach. The other big reason why India cannot use the expenditure approach is our high inflation rate. Because, in the expenditure approach, all the amounts are at the market prices, this method can only be used in those countries where the rate of inflation is negligible. If we use this method in high inflation nations, the amount of GDP will continue to grow higher, merely on account of inflation, even without any real growth in the economy. GDP in India is calculated on an annual basis. The estimate of GDP for any financial year is prepared at the beginning of the year, and every quarter thereafter. If there is any material change in the underlying assumptions and figures used in the estimate, then the amount GDP estimated is accordingly adjusted. The responsibility for calculation of official national GDP in India primarily lies with the Government of India's Central Statistical Office, which comes under the Ministry of Statistics and Programme Implementation, known as National Statistical Office, or the NSO. Now, we come to the process of calculation of GDP in India. For this, in simple terms, we should know two things, in relation to all the goods and services which are created in the country, during the period for which the GDP is planned to be calculated. First, we need to know how much of each of these goods or services will be produced in the entire economy. And secondly, what monetary value or prices should be assigned to each of these goods or services. Let us begin with the method of estimating the quantity of goods and services to be consumed. The most prominent source for this information is the survey by National Sample Survey Office, or the NSSO, which comes under the National Statistical Office. Apart from this, the estimates used in making the national budget, the information received from the statistical offices of the central and state government ministries, the Index of Industrial Production, popularly known as IIP, are used. Apart from this, the 5-year economic census, and the annual survey of industries, also provides a lot of data for GDP calculation. Then, there are reports from the Reserve Bank of India, public sector companies, boards of the central and state governments, departments and municipalities, the annual reports of companies, and figures of the census of citizens, which are also used in the estimation of GDP. Using the information from all these sources, the NSO estimates the consumption of goods and services in the country for the coming financial year. So the other question that remains after this is that of the price of all these goods and services. First, we calculate GDP using the current market price of the goods and services. This GDP, calculated at the current market prices, is called the nominal GDP. The problem with this figure is that we do not know which part of the change in amounts for each of the goods and services, included in the total figure of GDP, is attributable to merely a change in its prices, or inflation, and which, on account of a growth in its consumption. To solve this problem, we follow the practice of considering 1 year as base year for prices, and convert the current market prices into the base year prices. This GDP calculated at base year prices is called the real GDP. For adjustment of prices for inflation, the rate of inflation is taken from the price indices. There are two types of price indices in use in India. First, the Wholesale Price Index, or WPI, and the other, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Only the Consumer Price Index is used in the calculation of GDP. The custodian of the index for the wages of rural and agricultural labourers, and of the wages of urban industrial workers, is the Government of India's Ministry of Labour and Employment's Labour Bureau. The responsibility of collecting and collating of all other prices lies with the National Statistical Office, or the NSO. Using data obtained from both these sources, the NSO generates the price for each of the goods and services, for both urban and rural areas, for the whole nation. To understand how this price alignment happens, we can use an example. If year 1 is the base year, and after that in year 2, the price of a commodity goes up by 10%, and in the third year, the price increases by another 20%, Then, on the basis of this, the NSO calculates a price deflator for each year. Using this deflator, the current market price for each year is converted into the base year price. These prices are then used to calculate the real GDP at constant prices. From the year 2015, the prices of the year 2011-12 series are being used to calculate the Indian GDP. In this way, after the quantity and prices of all goods and services are known, their product is the amount of the contribution of that sector to the GDP. The aggregate of all these sectoral values is gross domestic product, or the GDP, for the year. However, in the amount derived in this way, two adjustments need to be made before releasing the final GDP figure. First, the total amount of indirect taxes, included in the value of goods and services involved, must be removed. As taxes are not a factor of production, because they do not give any value to customers of that commodity or service, and are more in the nature of an arbitrary amount of levy, based on some policy by the authorities, it is necessary to remove the effect of indirect taxes from the amount of the GDP, to arrive at the real value of the goods and services. The second adjustment, which is to be done, is for the amount of subsidies and grants that are given by the government in products and services like agricultural inputs, and for services like health or education. Because of these subsidies, the public pays a price for that product or service, which is lesser than its real value. By adding the amount of grants and subsidies back to GDP, we restore the true price of those goods and services included in the amount of GDP. The final GDP calculated in this way is released to the public. Because all the prices used in GDP calculation are in the local currency, it means that the original GDP is measured in the domestic currency. But because GDP figure is also used internationally for comparison and analysis, it also has to be converted into an international currency. The dollar is the currency used for this. If we use the market exchange rate for the dollar versus the rupee for this, then there is one problem in making a fair comparison. Because the market exchange rate for the rupee depends on, among other things, the change in the demand of the rupee in the international market. This rate does not reflect the true purchasing power of the rupee. This can be understood by an example. If the price of $1 is 70 Indian rupees, and 1 cup of coffee is available in the US for $1, but for 70 rupees, 2 cups of the exact same coffee are available in India, then it means that in terms of purchasing power, the price of $1 is 35 rupees. This is why, if we look at the year 2018, while the market price of dollar in Indian rupees was between 65 and 75 rupees, the adjusted exchange rate issued by the OECD, as per purchasing power parity, was 18.126 rupees for $1. A basket of commonly used goods and services is used to calculate this purchasing parity exchange rate, depending on the buying power of any currency, in reference to the goods and services in this basket. For this reason, if we look at the country report of the International Monetary Fund, for the year 2019, where, while India's nominal GDP was $2,935 billion, its GDP based on purchasing power parity was $11,325 billion international dollars. Due to this, while India was ranked 5th among the countries of the world, in terms of nominal GDP, India's ranking was 3rd in the world, based on purchasing power parity. This also means that India had become a $5 trillion GDP economy, a long time ago, by purchasing power parity. Equipped with this understanding of GDP, we are now in a position to explore more aspects of GDP calculation, and also get into understanding the recent controversies related to Indian GDP, and its growth figures. These include, understanding why the GDP figure does not reflect the complete or true picture of any nation or economy, and in the context of India, understanding what are some of the unique problems in the calculation of GDP in India. Along with these topics, we can also try and understand two of the current controversies related to Indian GDP. The first being, the attempt to change the base year by the Indian government, and the reason for the concern, economists and other experts have regarding this. And the second question is, of the correctness of the amount of Indian GDP, and the resultant doubts on the growth rate of Indian economy, and also the question, that whether, beyond merely a fall in the speed of growth, India is in a state of a contraction of the economy, meaning, in a recession. We will discuss all these, in the next video. If you have not already done so, please subscribe to our channel, and click on the all notifications button, so that you get the information, when the video is uploaded. If you, or someone you know, would prefer to watch this video in Hindi, you may use the link to the Hindi version, given in the video description below. If you liked this video, then do let us know, by clicking the like button. If you think that someone else you know, will benefit from, or enjoy the information given in this video, then please press the share button, to share this video with them. To watch more of such interesting and informative videos from us, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell icon, to get notified whenever we post a new video. If you need further clarification, on the topic of this video, or have any thoughts, suggestions, or opinions, that you would like to share with us, please do let us know, by commenting in the section for comments below the video. And with the hope, that you have a wonderful time. Until next time. Have a great day.